There are 5 main mechanisms of evolution: mutation, non-random mating, gene flow, genetic drift, and natural selection. These are important because they disrupt Hardy-Weinberg's equilibrium. If Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is maintained, then a species cannot change. The math for Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is important for understanding the disruptors. First, let's understand the math. There are 2 equations, but the first is P plus Q equals 1. P is the number of dominant alleles in a population, while Q is the number of recessive alleles in a population. The total amount of alleles adding up to 100%, or 1. This means if we know the percentage of either P or Q, we can find out how many of the other there are. For example, if they are 70% dominant, we can do 1 minus 0.7 and get 0.3. So 30% are recessive. The next equation is a little more complicated. The equation is P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. P squared represents the frequency of homozygous dominant genotypes, 2PQ represents heterozygous genotypes, and Q2 represents all recessive genotypes. The 1 again representing the entire population. Using these 2 equations together, once we find one of these values, P squared, Q squared, P or Q, we can find out all of the other values. Here is a word problem that uses this equation. The frequency of 2 alleles in a gene pool is 0.19 dominant and 0.81 recessive. Assume that the population is in Hardy-Weinberg's equilibrium. With this information, we can calculate homozygous recessive, homozygous dominant, and also heterozygous. P equals 0.19 and Q equals 0.81. If we square P and we square Q, then we get P squared and Q squared. All these individuals have big A, or little a, little a. Next we can find the heterozygous, the ones that have big A, little a. We do this using P times Q times 2. All of these numbers added together will give us 1. Now that we understand Hardy-Weinberg's equilibrium, we have to understand what disrupts it. Mutations are small mistakes in the DNA that can lead to an advantage or a disadvantage. These small errors can create new genes, change existing ones, or delete them. This changes the genetic pool for a species and disrupts the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Non-random mating is when a species chooses a mate based on a behavior, a look, a smell, or something else. Members of a species who have more attractive traits will get to pass their genes on to children, while those without don't. This disrupts Hardy-Weinberg's equilibrium, causing traits perceived as more attractive to be passed down to the next generation. Gene flow is the movement of genes in or out of a population. This could introduce more genes to a population, or cause genes to leave a population. This disrupts Hardy-Weinberg's equilibrium by causing different populations to exchange and change the amount of genes in each group. Genetic drift is when genes are removed from a population by a sort of bottleneck. This small sample can pass on their genes, and this disrupts Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium because the ratio that survives can be different from the original population. Natural selection is a process where the more adapted organism survives. The organisms that are better able to get food and reproduce pass on their genes. This causes genes that lead to an advantage getting passed on, while genes that don't die off. This disrupts Hardy-Weinberg's equilibrium because not all genes have the same chances of being passed down. Evolution is important in every part of biology. It creates the most beautiful and unique things. When you see an organism in its natural habitat, you know it has spent millions of years optimizing and slowly improving to fit its environment. Even though Hardy-Weinberg's equilibrium is not accurate in the real world, it's important for measuring how much a species has changed.